This is not a drill, this is not speculation, and this is not something that might happen tomorrow. This already happened. And if you're an American taxpayer, a small business owner, or simply someone who buys groceries in this country, what I'm about to explain could directly affect your wallet, your job, and the future of the American economy, so do not click away. Because on February 20th, 2026, something happened in Washington that almost nobody saw coming. The United States Supreme Court delivered a decision that sent shockwaves through the White House, through Wall Street, and through the entire global trading system. In a 6-2-3 ruling, the highest court in the United States told President Donald Trump that his sweeping global tariffs were illegal. Not questionable, not controversial, illegal. The court ruled that the tariffs were unconstitutional and unauthorized under U.S. law and that they had to stop immediately. Let that sink in for a moment. For the past year, the Trump administration had been presenting these tariffs as one of the most powerful economic strategies in modern American history. The president repeatedly described them as proof that the United States could force other countries to negotiate fairer trade deals. He said the tariffs would bring manufacturing jobs back to America. He said they would strengthen the U.S. economy, and he said foreign countries would ultimately pay the price. But when the issue reached the Supreme Court, the justices looked closely at the legal foundation behind those tariffs, and they came to a very different conclusion. The case that brought this issue before the court was called Learning Resources Incorporated versus Trump, and it was not just a single company filing a lawsuit. In fact, the case consolidated legal challenges from hundreds of businesses, importers, and even state governments. These companies argued that the president had gone far beyond his legal authority by imposing tariffs on imports from nearly every trading partner in the world. Their argument centered on a law that was passed nearly 50 years ago. The International Emergency Economic Powers Act, often referred to as IEEPA. This law was passed by Congress in 1977. Its purpose was to give presidents the ability to act quickly during serious international crises. For example, if a foreign government threatened American security, the president could use IEEPA to freeze assets, block financial transactions, or impose economic sanctions. But according to the businesses that filed the lawsuit, the law was never intended to give the president unlimited authority to impose tariffs across the global economy. They argued that tariffs are essentially a form of taxation, and under the U.S. Constitution, the power to impose taxes and regulate trade belongs primarily to Congress, not the president. When the Supreme Court examined the case, the majority of the justices agreed. The court's opinion made its position extremely clear. IEEPA allows presidents to impose economic sanctions during emergencies, but it does not give the president the authority to impose tariffs. That distinction became the central issue in the entire ruling. And once the court reached that conclusion, the legal foundation for the tariffs collapsed. The ruling effectively struck down one of the most aggressive trade policies of the Trump presidency. But the story did not end there, because what happened next inside the White House made the situation even more dramatic. When the news reached President Trump, he was reportedly in the middle of a meeting with several state governors. An aide handed him a note informing him of the Supreme Court's decision. Trump read it silently. According to one governor who later described the moment, Trump looked up and said just a few words, "That's a disgrace." And then he stood up and walked out of the meeting. Hours later, Trump appeared in the White House briefing room, and he made it very clear that he strongly disagreed with the court's decision. He described the ruling as deeply disappointing. He said he was ashamed of certain members of the court, and what made the situation even more remarkable was the fact that two of the justices who voted against him were people he personally appointed. Justice Amy Coney Barrett and Justice Neil Gorsuch. When reporters asked Trump whether he regretted appointing them to the court, he responded by saying their decision was terrible and even described it as an embarrassment to their families. It was an extraordinary moment in American politics, a sitting president publicly criticizing Supreme Court justices that he himself placed on the bench. But the biggest surprise was still coming, because instead of backing away from tariffs after the court's decision, the administration quickly began preparing a new strategy. Within hours, the White House signaled that it was ready to impose a brand new set of tariffs using a completely different law, and that decision would trigger an even larger political and legal battle. A battle that would involve state governments, massive corporations, and potentially hundreds of billions of dollars. Because instead of backing away after the Supreme Court ruling, the Trump administration moved incredibly fast to replace the tariffs that had just been declared illegal. Within hours of the court's decision, President Trump signed a new executive order. This order imposed a brand new global tariff of 10% on imported goods. But this time, the administration was not relying on the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the law that the Supreme Court had just ruled could not be used to impose tariffs. Instead, they turned to a completely different legal authority, a law known as Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974. Now, Section 122 is a much more limited law. It was originally designed as a temporary tool that presidents can use when the United States is facing serious problems with its balance of payments. In simple terms, if imports are flooding the country and threatening economic stability, the president can temporarily impose tariffs or quotas to slow things down. But there is an important restriction. Tariffs imposed under Section 122 are temporary. They can only remain in place for 150 days unless Congress approves an extension. That means the president cannot use this law to impose permanent global tariffs without cooperation from lawmakers. Still, the Trump administration made it clear that they intended to move forward aggressively. Shortly after the executive order was signed, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent appeared on television to explain the administration's strategy. During an interview on CNBC, Bessent said the 10% tariff was only the beginning. According to him, the administration planned to increase the tariff to 15% within days. And by August, tariff levels could effectively return to where they had been before the Supreme Court struck them down. In other words, the administration was determined to keep the tariff strategy alive, even if it meant finding new legal pathways to do it. To supporters of the president, this was proof that the administration was committed to protecting American industries. But to critics, it looked like something very different. They saw it as an attempt to circumvent the Supreme Court's decision, and it did not take long for legal opposition to form. Within days of the new tariffs being announced, a coalition of 24 states filed a brand new lawsuit. The lawsuit was led by New York Attorney General Letitia James, and the argument presented by the states was blunt. They said the administration was attempting to do indirectly what the Supreme Court had already ruled it could not do directly. According to the lawsuit, Section 122 was never intended to be used for sweeping global tariffs. It was designed as a short-term economic stabilization tool, not a long-term trade policy. The states also argued that the tariffs functioned as a massive tax on American consumers, because despite the political messaging that foreign countries pay tariffs, that is not how tariffs actually work. When a tariff is imposed on imports, it is not paid by the foreign exporter. It is paid by the American company importing the goods. And those companies almost always pass the cost along to consumers through higher prices. That means the real burden of tariffs ultimately falls on American households and businesses. Small businesses in particular have been some of the most vocal critics. Many of them rely on imported materials to manufacture products or run their operations. When tariffs increase those costs, they face a difficult choice: raise prices for customers, cut jobs, or absorb the losses themselves. And for many small companies, absorbing those losses simply isn't possible. That is why hundreds of businesses joined the original lawsuit that reached the Supreme Court. And now many of those same businesses are preparing for the next legal battle. But there is another issue looming over this entire conflict, a massive financial question that could determine how this story ultimately ends, because the tariffs that the Supreme Court just struck down had already generated enormous amounts of money for the federal government. By the end of 2025, the U.S. government had collected more than $130 billion from those tariffs. Economists believe the final number could reach as high as $175 billion. Now consider what that means if the tariffs were illegal. Then what happens to the money that was collected? Does the government keep it, or does it have to give it back? That question is about to become one of the biggest legal and financial battles in modern American trade history, because thousands of companies are now preparing to demand refunds. Major corporations, small businesses, importers across the country. All of them are asking the same question: if the tariffs were illegal, where is their money? And the answer to that question could cost the U.S. government hundreds of billions of dollars. That refund battle is already beginning to unfold in federal courts. And what happens next could reshape the entire economic and political landscape of this story, because once the question of refunds enters the picture, the stakes become far higher. Up until now, the debate over tariffs had largely focused on trade policy, presidential authority, and the balance of power between Congress and the White House. But once the Supreme Court ruled that the tariffs were illegal, a completely new issue emerged: money, a staggering amount of money. By the end of 2025, the U.S. federal government had collected more than $130 billion from the tariffs that were just struck down by the Supreme Court. And according to economists at the Penn-Wharton budget model at the University of Pennsylvania, the total potential refund exposure could reach $175 billion. That is an extraordinary number. To put it into perspective, that is more money than the entire annual budget of many U.S. government agencies. And now the question facing federal officials is simple: if the tariffs were illegal, does the government have to give that money back? For thousands of companies across the United States, the answer to that question should be obvious. They believe the money must be returned, because they were the ones who paid those tariffs in the first place. Contrary to popular political rhetoric, tariffs are not paid by foreign governments. They are paid by American importers when goods enter the country. Those importers then pass the costs along through higher prices, supply chain adjustments, and reduced investment. In other words, the money ultimately came from American businesses and American consumers, and now many of those businesses want it back. More than 2,000 companies have already filed lawsuits demanding refunds. Some of the names involved are enormous. Major corporations like Costco and FedEx have joined the legal fight, but the movement is not being driven only by large corporations. In fact, many of the most vocal supporters of the refund effort are small businesses. A coalition known as We Pay the Tariffs, which represents more than 1,000 small companies, has been leading the push for refunds. Their argument is straightforward. If the government collected money through tariffs that were not legally authorized, that money should be returned to the people and businesses who paid it. And recently, they received an important victory. On March 4th, a federal judge named Richard Eaton, who serves on the U.S. Court of International Trade, issued a significant ruling. Judge Eaton determined that importers who paid the tariffs are entitled to benefit from the Supreme Court decision. He ordered U.S. Customs and Border Protection to stop collecting the illegal tariffs and begin preparing the administrative process needed to issue refunds. For many companies, that ruling felt like a major breakthrough. But it did not mean the money would be returned immediately. In fact, government officials quickly made it clear that the refund process could take a very long time. Shortly after the ruling, U.S. Customs and Border Protection announced that it was preparing an electronic system to handle refund requests. However, the agency also said that the system would not be ready for at least 45 days. And even after the system is completed, refunds will not happen automatically. Companies will have to formally file claims requesting the return of their money. That means every importer must submit documentation showing exactly how much they paid under the tariffs. Then the government must verify those claims before issuing refunds. With thousands of companies involved, that process could become extremely complicated. Some legal experts believe the refund battle could drag on for years. And in fact, President Trump himself appeared to acknowledge that possibility. During a press conference at the White House, reporters asked the president whether his administration planned to honor the refunds. Trump's response was vague. He suggested that the issue would likely be fought in court for as long as 5 years. Then he looked at the reporters and said, "I just told you the answer, right?" For many critics, that response raised serious concerns, because if the administration chooses to challenge the refunds in court, the legal battle could become one of the largest financial disputes in modern U.S. history. And that leads to another important question: where would the money come from? If courts ultimately rule that the government must refund $175 billion, the Treasury would need to find a way to cover that enormous obligation. Some economists believe the government might need to borrow additional money, which would add to the national debt. Others believe the administration may attempt to offset those refunds by imposing new tariffs under different legal authorities. If that happens, American businesses and consumers could effectively end up paying twice, once through the tariffs that were declared illegal, and again through new tariffs designed to replace them. That possibility has become a major point of political debate. Lawmakers from several states are already demanding that the government issue refunds as quickly as possible. Meanwhile, thousands of companies are preparing their legal strategies, because for them, this fight is not just about trade policy. It is about recovering money that they believe was collected illegally. And as this refund battle begins to unfold, it is creating ripple effects far beyond the courtroom. Because while the United States is now facing a massive financial dispute over tariffs, other countries are watching closely, and some of them have already started adjusting their economic strategies in response. One country in particular has been preparing for this moment for years: Canada. And the way Canada has responded to this entire trade conflict reveals a very different approach to economic strategy. Because while the United States is now facing a massive legal battle over tariffs and a potential $175 billion refund crisis, other countries have been watching this situation very closely, and some of them have already been preparing for it. One country in particular stands out: Canada. For years, the Canadian economy has been deeply connected to the United States. The two countries share one of the largest trading relationships in the world. Every single day, billions of dollars worth of goods cross the border between the two nations. But when the Trump administration began imposing aggressive tariffs on multiple trading partners, Canadian leaders realized something important. Their economic dependence on the United States could become a serious vulnerability, and that realization led to a long-term strategy that is now starting to look surprisingly effective. Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney, who took office in 2025, had been quietly preparing for exactly this kind of trade conflict. Instead of responding with loud political rhetoric, Carney focused on strengthening Canada's economic position. His government launched a massive $5 billion strategic response fund designed to support businesses that were affected by U.S. tariffs. The goal was simple: provide financial support to Canadian companies so they could adapt to changing trade conditions without collapsing. At the same time, the Canadian government introduced a nationwide Buy Canadian procurement policy. Under this policy, federal agencies were encouraged to prioritize Canadian suppliers when purchasing goods and services. The idea was to strengthen domestic industries and reduce reliance on foreign imports. Carney's government also expanded loan programs for small and medium-sized businesses. These programs allowed companies to access financing more easily during the trade disruptions caused by tariffs. But perhaps the most important part of Canada's strategy involved expanding trade relationships with other countries. Instead of relying so heavily on the American market, Canada began aggressively building new economic partnerships. One of the most significant developments was a major trade agreement with China. The agreement included reduced tariffs on several key Canadian exports. Products like canola, lobster, crab, and peas suddenly had expanded access to a market of more than 1.4 billion consumers. That kind of market access created enormous opportunities for Canadian producers. Meanwhile, the government also invested billions of dollars in supporting major industries like steel, lumber, and automobiles. These industries had been particularly vulnerable to American tariffs, but the new investment programs helped stabilize them while Canada searched for new export markets. Prime Minister Carney later made a statement that captured the broader shift in Canada's economic thinking. He told Canadians that the decades-long process of building an increasingly close economic relationship with the United States was coming to an end. For years, that relationship had been considered one of Canada's greatest economic strengths. But now, Carney argued, it had become a vulnerability, and his government was determined to reduce that risk. One of the most ambitious goals of the strategy was to double Canada's non-U.S. exports over the next decade. If successful, that plan would fundamentally reshape Canada's economic relationships with the rest of the world. And now, after the Supreme Court ruling in the United States, many analysts believe Canada's approach is starting to look very smart. While the U.S. government is now dealing with lawsuits, refund claims, and political battles over tariffs, Canada has been quietly expanding its economic options. Some trade experts even argue that Canada could emerge from this entire situation stronger than it was before the trade conflict began. But the ripple effects of the Supreme Court ruling are not limited to North America. The entire global trading system is now facing uncertainty. Countries that negotiated trade agreements with the United States during the tariff period are now trying to figure out what happens next. If the legal foundation for those tariffs has been removed, it raises serious questions about the agreements that were built around them. Some governments have already begun reassessing their positions. The European Union, for example, has reportedly paused ratification of certain trade discussions with the United States until there is greater legal clarity. Other countries are doing the same, because when trade policies change suddenly, it creates uncertainty, and uncertainty can slow investment, disrupt supply chains, and affect global markets. Companies around the world now have to reconsider their long-term strategies. Should they continue relying on the American market, or should they diversify their supply chains and export destinations? These are the kinds of questions that business leaders are now asking, and the answers could reshape international trade for years to come. But while global leaders are responding to these changes in their own ways, the most important legal and political consequences are still unfolding inside the United States. Because the Supreme Court's ruling did more than strike down a set of tariffs, it drew a clear constitutional line about the limits of presidential power. And that legal principle could shape American trade policy far beyond the current administration. Because while the economic consequences of this Supreme Court ruling are enormous, the legal consequences may be even more important. At its core, this case was not just about tariffs. It was about power. Specifically, it was about who has the authority to make major economic decisions that affect the entire country. For years, presidents from both political parties have relied on emergency powers to act quickly during international crises. Those powers can be incredibly useful in situations where the government needs to respond immediately to threats. But critics have long warned that emergency powers can also be stretched far beyond their original purpose, and in this case, the Supreme Court decided that the line had been crossed by a 6-3 majority. The court ruled that the president cannot use a decades-old emergency law to impose sweeping tariffs across the global economy. The justices made it clear that tariffs are not just a small regulatory tool, they are effectively a form of taxation. And under the U.S. Constitution, the power to impose taxes and regulate trade belongs primarily to Congress.